Welcome to Outlaw Woodworking. You know, for the longest time, I've needed a table saw sled. I put off making one because I really didn't want to stick with this DeWalt table saw. Even though it is a really good working, for a small saw, it works really good. It's square, the fence is square, it operates nicely. But I was hoping to upgrade to a bigger table saw. So I put off making this table saw sled. A while back I made one for my router, this one, and it works so good. And right now I'm kind of in Christmas present mode, and I'm trying to make a lot of cutting boards. And one of the things I want to do is do a lot of laminations, and then cut them and then laminate them again, and try to make a little nicer stuff. And you really need a table saw sled to do some nice stuff like that. So anyway, I built this table saw sled. Let me show you how I did it. The first thing I do is grab my Rockler apron, get ready to go to work, get some safety glasses, go over the chop saw. I cut this piece of 3/4 in half, and basically it was just big enough to be the back and the front of the router sled. I then laminate it together and basically let this sit overnight. A lot of squeeze out there. Better too much than too little though, I guess. Once I get that all clamped up, I go over and I make the tracks for the DeWalt saw. I look at my router sled that I had, and I kind of compared what I liked about it, and I made basically a smaller version of the router sled for the table saw sled. And I really wanted to make a small one, so I checked this piece for square, and then I start to rip these track pieces, and I want these to be as tight as possible in the two tracks on the table saw. I can always sand them a little bit, but right now I want them to be tight, like where they can't even move. I then grab some 6 nuts from this box so that I can put these inside the track and basically hold the wood up off of the track. So I place these nuts in the track, and then I put the pieces of wood in on top of those nuts. Now I'm going to glue this and leave it overnight. That way, and this particular saw, the fence is really square, so I'm going to use the fence, and I'm going to square up these pieces of wood and glue them and leave them overnight. And so here's where I just glue this thing up. And then I square it. I use my square and I square this whole thing on the fence. That actually ended up working really well. I then get some heavy steel parts that I had in the shop, which were some tow hitches, and I leave that overnight. The next morning it was cold, so I turned on my pellet stove, and I start with the first thing, the laminated piece that I glued together, and I get that thing taken apart, and I start cleaning off one side of it. I get a chisel and I just get one side nice and straight and get some of that glue off. That way I could run it through the fence on the table saw. Now I cut it perfectly in half, and so that I have 2 sides. I then take it over and I chop off. I figured out the measurement of the width of the table saw sled, and I cut both pieces to that width. I then take it over and I mark it, and I figured out I kind of want it to be similar to the router sled, so I make a higher center section, and you need that for the thickness so that it doesn't fall apart when you're cutting it in half when you run it through the table saw. So I mark both these pieces, and that's basically the shape that I'm going to use. I go over to my grizzly bandsaw and I start cutting out both those pieces. I then take them over to the router and I router all sides except for the bottom where I'm going to glue it to the table saw sled. Once I get this part all routed, I then go over and I get the bottom of it prepared. I get out my little samurai sword and I cut these pieces off, the edges. Then I start sanding it. And it did take quite a bit of sanding for me and cleaning to get it to track really nice. I did have the pieces of wood a lot wider than they could have been, a little thinner, but I really wanted it as tight as possible so that when I used it, I didn't have any slop in it. So once I get done sanding this whole thing, and so it's running, halfway decent on the track. After I get it where it's tracking good on the tracks, I then get prepared to mount the pieces on the front and the back. The front, I'm not worried about right off the bat because that's not the square part that you're cutting. So I just glue that nice and straight along the back, and I clamp it. I get my nail gun and I shoot that front piece in. I mark an arrow so that I know that's the direction. That's going to be the front of the table saw sled. I then shoot it with stainless steel nails, clean it off, and then get ready to put now this piece is the critical piece. This piece needs to be as square as possible. So I use my square. I get it marked out so I know that it's right where I want it, and I get it prepared to glue and nail it on there. Now at this point, I'm using the square the whole time. It takes me a few minutes to clamp that and get it really dialed in. Once I get both sides and clamped, I can take it off and then nail it. And at this point, it's pretty solid right there. I then take some wax, and in this case, it's what kind of wax was that? I don't know, some kind of wax. But I take the wax and I wax the bottom, and then I run the whole table through the saw. Now right here, I'm going to check the saw for square. So I take this little piece and I cut it 3 times, or I cut 4 sides of it into a little square, and then I check it for squareness. And I was really surprised. It was perfect. Thanks for watching Outlaw Woodworking. Even though I wanted a bigger table saw, I'm really excited to have this, and I made a really small one. I mean, this thing's only 20 inches wide and it's 20 by 18. I used 3/4 plywood, and yeah, I put wax on the bottom runners, and the runners are pretty tight. You can't move it side to side, and that's kind of what you want, so you don't get any variation in your cut. Yeah, it slides really nice. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Subscribe, ring the bell, and I will see you next time. I'm looking forward to my next video. You'll see some better cutting boards and hopefully some better stuff. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Later.